Hi, this session has 3 parts, each lasting about 20 minutes. Part 1 will consist of a presentation. I'll describe how typology and the transcendent function fit into Jung's general theory of opposites. I'll also show how this theory relates to Nelson Mandela's life and work. For copyright reasons, only Part 1 can be recorded. In Part 2, we'll look at some clips from the film Invictus. This is Clint Eastwood's film about Nelson Mandela and the 1995 Rugby World Cup. We will examine Nelson Mandela's example because he illustrates some of the most important ideas in the book Psychological Types that Jung repeatedly claimed were commonly overlooked. And in Part 3, we'll have some time for discussion about what you've seen and heard. The theme of this year's conference is breaking through with type. I'm going to look at breaking through in 2 ways, breaking through vertically and breaking through horizontally. What I mean by vertical breakthrough is that we can go beyond our own typology to develop the transcendent function. This diagram represents the vertical development that Jung described in Psychological Types, mainly in chapters 2 and 5. I've discussed some of these ideas at previous BAPT sessions and in my book. There is also a discussion between myself and John Beebe about it that you can read by going to the short link at the bottom, myers.co/Beebe. In summary, Jung's process of vertical development has 4 stages. We start at stage 1, which is being undifferentiated. Stage 2 involves becoming a type. I'll talk about the 3rd stage shortly using Marie-Louise von Franz's lectures on typology. But in summary, this stage occurs when we try to get to grips with the inferior function. We fail in the attempt and the typological structure of consciousness collapses. Stage 4 is what emerges from that collapse, the transcendent function. It involves the transformation of consciousness and a new attitude. The horizontal breakthrough is that this process not only applies to typology, but also to many other kinds of attitude or opposite. That includes politics, religion, culture, race, gender, and so on. Jung uses typology as an example because it is a commonly occurring and important one. Also, Jung believed that typological conflict explained the breakdown of relations between himself, Freud, and Adler. But he also took this process of transcending opposites and applied it to other areas. So the horizontal breakthrough is taking this 4-stage process and applying it to other areas to help mitigate political polarization, the culture wars, racial divisions, and so on. The pinnacle of this process of development is the transcendent function. This is not a Jungian invention. It is Jung's term for a natural phenomenon. If we can learn to recognize it, we can find it in lots of people and places around us. Jung said there is nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the transcendent function. It is a psychological function that bridges opposing attitudes and functions, whether they are political, religious, cultural, or typological. It also bridges consciousness and the unconscious. In typological terms, it displaces the superior function so that the transcendent function becomes sovereign in our conscious psyche, and it brings a flexibility of attitude. Marie-Louise von Franz tells us more about the transcendent function in her lectures on typology and in the Q&As afterwards. She makes one point that seems directly relevant to Nelson Mandela. She was asked if there was a situation where functions do not differentiate one-sidedly. That's stage 2 in Jung's vertical process of development. She said yes, there is a situation where functions do not differentiate one-sidedly. For instance, people who still live completely in nature. In natural situations, things are more or less arranged so that one must, to a certain extent, use all the functions. That is why people who live under natural conditions rarely become as one-sided. Nelson Mandela was brought up in a natural environment in the Xhosa tribe. He moved to a more Western culture in his teenage years. This background provided an alternative route for developing the transcendent function, and at a much earlier stage in life. But for those of us who have been brought up in a one-sided Western culture, we have to go through this process in full. We go through the second stage of becoming a type, of becoming one-sided. At that stage, we develop 1, then 2, then perhaps even 3 functions, and we might even dip into the 4th function occasionally. Even so, that is still a one-sided differentiation. If we try to develop the 4th function properly, we can't do it because it is too big a problem. When that happens, according to von Franz, we may pull out of the attempt. We stick with the 3 functions and just dabble with the inferior function. In a lecture Q&A, she said, a great many people who from time to time experience the problem of the inferior function, what I've spoken of as getting into the hot bath and then jumping out of it again, more or less go on with their 3 functions. The 4th is the devil who remains in the corner of their life. People who stick in this phase never quite understand what Jung means by the problem of the 4th, and they never quite understand what individuation really means. She continues by saying, they remain in the conventional former world of identifying with consciousness. Even many people who have undergone a Jungian analysis do not get further than those brief visits into the 4th realm and then talking about it to others. So what von Franz is saying is that we can develop 1, 2, or even 3 functions and then stop there. We just dip in and out of the 4th and fail to come to terms with what it really means. We never properly engage with the unconscious or the problem of evil, and so on, because we never let go of our superior function or our typology. But if we do try to embrace the 4th function fully, the whole conscious structure, the typological structure, collapses, and that is when the transcendent function starts to emerge. To the 4 comes a 5th thing that is not the 4, but is something beyond them and consists of them all. It means a consolidated nucleus of the personality that is no longer identified with any of the functions. The 4 functions remain, but only as instruments that can be used at will, taking them up and putting them down again. Von Franz is describing how the transcendent function transforms the personality. It doesn't change the biological foundations of our character, but it changes our attitudes, the structure of our consciousness, our psychological functioning, and our whole personality. And the transcendent function becomes the function with which you move along through life. Breaking through to the transcendent function in this way, in the realm of politics and race relations, is what Nelson Mandela did. I'm not going to look at Mandela in terms of typology because that was not the most intense form of conflict that he experienced. The greatest form of opposition that he had to overcome was racial. He was a victim of apartheid, and as a lawyer he represented people who were also victims of apartheid. Yet when Mandela was sent to prison in 1964, he said something remarkable. He made a statement from the dock that included saying, I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. What Nelson Mandela is illustrating here is the transcendent function. He is showing how we can go beyond type vertically and beyond type horizontally by developing the transcendent function for racial and political opposites. His statement isn't a one-sided standpoint. It isn't, in Jung's model of development, a stage 2 rally cry in support of the blacks. This is a stage 4 rally cry in support of a greater cause, in support of a new attitude of racial reconciliation and equality. Mandela had the flexibility that comes from the transcendent function to fight for the blacks or for the whites in order to make sure that neither dominated. We're now going to look at some more examples of Nelson Mandela's transcendent function in some clips from the film Invictus. The main opposites that we are looking at in this film are racial, between blacks and whites. There were other ethnicities involved as well, but the film looks at what was the main conflict at the time. And we are looking at how Nelson Mandela holds the tension of opposites and transcends them, and thereby transforms the attitudes and culture within South Africa. The film Invictus focuses on one event that Mandela used in transcending the racial opposites. It focuses on the 1995 Rugby World Cup that took place in South Africa. The film is based on the non-fiction book Playing the Enemy, Nelson Mandela and the Game That Made a Nation, which was written by the British journalist John Carlin. The film is a fairly accurate depiction of the book, the events that took place and their importance. As background, in 1992, President de Klerk called a referendum of whites to end apartheid. Many whites voted to end apartheid because they wanted South Africa to play international rugby again. That is how important rugby and sport was to many of the white population. Also, within the film, some events happened more or less as depicted. But in others, Eastwood has used a bit of poetic license for production or entertainment reasons. For example, you will see a scene in which Francois Pienaar, the captain of the South African rugby team, has been invited to have tea with President Mandela. That event took place pretty much as depicted, and the dialogue in the film is almost verbatim the same as the dialogue reported in the book. However, there is another scene in which Mandela stands up and makes a statement to the Black Sports Council about keeping the hated Springbok emblem. He did make a public statement, but not in a single meeting. Because of the widespread opposition to the idea, he called members of the Sports Council in, one by one, and talked to them individually. The film condenses a complex process of persuasion down to one scene. It accurately conveys the sense of what happened, even though the facts have been altered to fit within the condensed time frame of the film. And of course there is a wider context and lots of other things going on that the film doesn't include. The film just gives us one piece in the overall picture. Now there's a lot happening in this film, so it may be helpful to give you some forewarning of some of the things that Mandela did that involved managing the tension of opposites, which is stage 3 of Jung's developmental process. You don't need to spot all these, and you may spot other things. For example, he doesn't renounce violence when he leaves prison, but he also calls for non-violence. Although he's black, there are times when he supports whites, and he opposes blacks. He blends symbols from both sides, such as the black national anthem and the white Springbok emblem. Mandela uses the emotional and symbolic potential of sport to break down barriers and build a common sense of purpose. He treats everyone as part of his family, irrespective of the colour of their skin. And he gets help from people who, like him, want to work towards reconciliation. And I should add that he was very lucky, though Mandela created the conditions to be lucky. He put South Africa in a position where they could make the most of their luck. So I'll share the film now.